Hello everybody and welcome to the PnP virtual conference. I'm Paolo Pialorsi from PSys.com and today we are going to talk about the architecture of custom solutions built on top of Microsoft 365. Before digging into the content of the session, let me spend a few words about myself. I'm Paolo, I work in a company of my own called PSys.com, which is based in Italy and in the USA, and on a daily basis I support my customers to create or migrate solutions for Microsoft 365. Specifically, I support customers to migrate solutions from the old school development model to the SharePoint framework. I help customers to create Microsoft Teams custom developed solutions, and I help customers to migrate from old school workflows based solutions to Power Automate and Logic Apps. On a daily basis, I love spending time with my family, indeed, as well as I love to do my job because my job is actually my hobby, and I really like driving my car. If you want, you can subscribe to my YouTube channel called PSys Tech Bytes, where I publish on a weekly basis technical videos about the topics that I cover on a daily basis in my job. As well as, if you like, you can follow me on Twitter. @PaoloPia is my Twitter account. So, in this session we are going to have a look at the architecture of a Microsoft 365 custom solution. And specifically, we will see what the services are in Microsoft 365 and in Microsoft Azure that we can leverage to create a custom solution built on top of Microsoft 365. At the end, we will also put it all together and see the architecture of a real solution, which most likely you already know, which is the Microsoft Lookbook site. As a side note, here I'm going to share what is my experience on the field, so maybe you will agree, maybe you will not agree on what I will share, but that's my feeling, that's my advice whenever you want to create a solution based on Microsoft 365. So, first of all, we need to give an answer to this question. Why building a Microsoft 365 custom solution? Well, Microsoft 365 offers a rich set of highly available and highly scalable services like Azure Active Directory for identity management, authentication and authorization, Exchange Online for messaging, SharePoint Online for documents and content management, OneDrive for business, Microsoft Teams, of course, for communication and integration, and so on and so forth. So plenty of services that you can use to build solutions. So my point of view is that rather than reinventing the wheel, you should try to use the services already available in Microsoft 365 to build your own custom solutions. And for whatever is not available through those services, you can build custom code, custom solutions, which will sit on top of the out-of-the-box services provided. So what kind of solutions can we build with Microsoft 365? Just to make an example, we can create process automation solutions. So for example, document management, approval flows, HR or HSE procedures and stuff like that. You can create automated provisioning solutions, which includes provisioning of sites in SharePoint Online or of Teams in Microsoft Teams, or both of them, so sites and Teams all together in a unique solution. Or you can build a solution for line of business integration. So for example, you can integrate with the purchase order system, you can create customers and suppliers sign up or registration forms and stuff like that. So this is just a small set of examples of solutions that you can build leveraging Microsoft 365. And whenever you do that, there are some technical challenges that you need to face and that you need to manage defining the architecture of your solution. This is just a small set, even if it looks like a wide set of challenges, but these are just the most important challenges when you create a solution. The high availability and scalability, the security, providing a proper UI set of elements, business logic, hosting of the solution, managing of multiple environments and tenants, having a content repository for your content and documentation, having monitoring and telemetry in place, and of course defining an architecture which is a maintainable architecture on the go. So let's talk about all of these challenges and let's see what the solutions are nowadays whenever you want to create such kind of solution. Thinking about high availability and scalability, one main topic is the persistent storage. So whenever you need to store data, if you need to store data, of course, you need to define the target persistence layer based on the kind of data that you want to store. So, for example, if you want to store list items, objects, and such kind of stuff, one option could be to use a truly relational solution like Azure SQL Database, eventually with Entity Framework in the backend with .NET Core. But if data is not relational, you should consider using a polyglot persistence infrastructure, like, for example, Azure Cosmos DB. For example, for storing list of items or objects with a huge amount of items, you shouldn't use a SharePoint list because you would have slow performances, list view threshold issues, and also complex life while writing the queries to query the list. Eventually, you can consider Microsoft lists, but in my opinion, for this kind of list of items and objects, a relational database or a polyglot system are the best options. On the contrary, if you need to store documents or files, try to use SharePoint Online and OneDrive for Business because that's why they are here. And you can use Microsoft Graph or eventually you can fall back onto SPO REST and CSOM to access those documents, those files stored in SharePoint Online and OneDrive for Business. Still, from an high availability and scalability point of view, you shouldn't write custom code, or at least you should try to stay away from custom code as much as you can. But if you really need to write custom code, at least you should make it possible to have that code highly available and scalable, meaning that you need to make it asynchronous always. You need to make the code repeatable, idempotent, monitorable, and maintainable on the go. So you need to take care of the versioning, you need to have a proper deployment plan, a proper release plan, and stuff like that, because you need to be a responsible developer. Still, about scalability and availability, as I said, always write asynchronous code. So avoid writing business logic in the UI, avoid having in the web part, in the UI widget, in the Teams tab, the business logic. Rather use a backend asynchronous set of microservices that you can execute in the background and that you can fire using an Azure function, a blob storage queue, or a service bus. My opinion, you should never live execute complex tasks in the UI. Rather, you should enqueue requests to execute them and then process them in the backend. Some ideas to do that? Well, first of all, if you have a web UI or a native app, you can rely on a backend Azure function, eventually a durable function, and do the stuff in the background. But in case of any failure of the function or of the connection between the UI and the function, of course, your solution will not be highly available. So, to improve the availability, you should put in the middle between the front end and the back end storage queue so that you can use an asynchronous pattern. You can store a message in the queue and the job and the function will dequeue the message and process it as soon as they are available. For a better availability and for a more enterprise level solution, you should consider using a service bus instead of the storage queue because the service bus is a more enterprise-ready service on Azure rather than the storage queue. In fact, with the service bus, for example, you can suspend the queue, you can stop listening for a queue, and then you can resume listening when you are ready, when you updated the job, for example, or stuff like that. Still talking about scalability and availability, think about caching. The best way to fast execute code is to not execute it. So use caching. You can use Azure Redis Cache to store objects and state information. You can use the Azure Blob Storage to store binaries and blobs so that you can make them available through a content delivery network. And you can use SharePoint Online and OneDrive for Business to store files that you can eventually convert on the fly into PDF using the Microsoft Graph. So, for example, if you are storing invoices or quotes or stuff like that, you can easily convert them into PDF on the fly with Microsoft Graph. From a security point of view, authentication and authorization really matter in any kind of solution, specifically in a Microsoft 365 solution where you should rely on Azure Active Directory. So always use Azure Active Directory for managing and storing users, roles, apps, and permissions. Register all of your applications in Azure Active Directory. The front-end application most likely will use delegated access tokens. The back-end application will use application service account that will work with an application only token, or eventually will leverage the delegated access token of the front end using the on behalf flow. If you are creating and registering an application in Azure Directory, a very common question is, should I create it as a single tenant or as a multi-tenant solution? Well, generally speaking, this is just a general rule. If your application is targeting just one company, just one tenant, you should go for single tenant. If you are creating a solution that you want to sell, to provide to multiple customers, well, you should go for multiple tenant solution. Whatever will be your choice, open authorization is your best friend. So configure authentication for your application. If it is application only, you should prefer using an X509 certificate for authentication rather than the shared secret. And configure the permission that you need to access the backend APIs, whether it is the Microsoft Graph or the SharePoint Online APIs or Power BI or whatever else. Use the delegated permissions if you need to execute the tasks on behalf of the user, so from a front-end or a native application. Use the application permissions if you need to execute those tasks from a back-end system like an Azure Function, a PowerShell script, or a web job. And keep into account that you also have the on-behalf flow that you can use through Azure Active Directory, Open Authorization, and MSAL, Microsoft Authentication Library, in order to get an access token on the front-end layer and provide an access token to the back-end layer, where in the back-end you can create an on-behalf token which will allow you to consume a back-end API like Microsoft Graph, for example, on behalf of the user consuming the front-end UI. Whenever you need to store secure information like the certificates for X509 application authentication or a shared secret or whatever else, you should rely on Azure Key Vault, which is the right place to store tokens, passwords, certificates, and stuff like that, as well as sensitive application settings. But keep in mind that the Azure Key Vault is scalable if you read it. However, if you plan to have high volume writes on the Key Vault, that's not the intended use for that service, and you will easily get throttled. So that's okay to use Azure Key Vault for high volume reads. It is not okay to use the Azure Key Vault for high volume writes. And eventually you will have to think about something else, like a SQL database with encrypted table or something like that. When you use Azure Key Vault, try to avoid using a user account to access the Key Vault. Rather use an Azure Managed Identity and configure an application in Azure AD, granting that application the right to access the Azure Key Vault. When you define the user interface of your solution, usually I try to use Microsoft Teams as the host nowadays because it is the best option, the fully integrated option that most of the companies and enterprise companies are willing to use nowadays. So I create SharePoint Framework web parts that I host in Microsoft Teams, or I create personal or custom team tabs using Yeoman Generator for Teams. And I create the UI inside Microsoft Teams so that it is fully integrated with the experience that users use on a daily basis nowadays. If you need to collect information from the users, you can use Power Apps hosted inside Teams. You can use adaptive cards. You can use Logic Apps and Power Automate, and adaptive cards in between still hosted in Microsoft Teams. And if you need to provide a feedback to the users, you can write back to the channels or to a chat using a bot, for example, or you can use the Graph API to write back into a channel and use the Graph API to interact with Microsoft Teams. So nowadays, Microsoft Teams for me is the best host for your solution, so that you will have out of the box the web UI, the mobile UI, and the desktop UI across multiple operating systems. So really, really cool option. And what if you need to run business logic? As I said, you should avoid having business logic in the front end. You should rather have the business logic in the back end, and there you should leverage Power Automate or Azure Logic Apps or some custom code. If you want to use Power Automate, that's the great option for personal processes and flows. So, in my opinion, it is a user-centric software as a service solution for building processes and flows, personal processes and flows. It is mainly focused on approval processes, synchronization processes, and notifications, and it is fully integrated with the out-of-the-box workloads of Microsoft 365, as well as with external applications. if you want to build something enterprise ready and with the idea of enterprise level processes and solution, personally, I rather use Logic Apps, which is, in my opinion, again, a process-centric platform as a service offering. It has a deeper integration with external systems like ADI, business-to-business systems, and stuff like that. It is at the basis of Power Automate, nevertheless. So same engine, same web-based designer, same connectors, but also with a designer for Visual Studio if you want to build a solution that you also want to maintain from a source control point of view. You can eventually think about writing custom code, but as I said, as a responsible developer, you should try to stay away from custom code as much as you can. But if you will do that because you need to do something really uncommon, mind the hidden cost of management and maintenance of your custom code. And then still do that, because if you need it, why not? Whenever you will use Power Automate, Logic Apps, or custom code, Microsoft Graph is your master key to access Microsoft 365 resources. You can use Microsoft Graph to access every kind of object in your solution, and Microsoft Graph is the right choice whenever you need to read, to consume, to manage the resources in Microsoft 365 from a developer point of view. You can access users, groups, teams, everything, almost everything in Microsoft 365 workload. Keep into account that the V1 version of the graph is the released one, the production one. You can always fall back to the beta if you really need to use something which is not available yet in the V1, but in theory, the beta endpoint is not production ready, so keep it into account. And using the Microsoft Graph is the main reason why, in my opinion, you should always register your applications in Azure Active Directory in order to being able to access Microsoft Graph in the backend. Once you have defined a solution, you need to host that solution. And again, my suggestion is to use Azure App Services and Azure Web Apps, or eventually the Azure Static Web if you just need to provide static content like JavaScript, CSS, and stuff like that, so that you can easily enable the CDN of Azure Static Web and provide the content with a really quick and available infrastructure. You should leverage the deployment slots of Azure App Services so that you can easily manage multiple environments. More will come on this topic soon. You should, or at least you can, leverage the Azure Active Directory integration for authentication so that you can easily authenticate users in your Azure App Service still using Azure Active Directory, which is the central point of security in your solution architecture. And if you want, you can leverage Azure Web Jobs, sharing the same hosting environment, or Azure Functions, sharing the same app service plan, so that you can have a unique cost center in Azure for hosting all of these services. Whenever you create an app service, an app web hosted in an app service, you should try to rely on .NET Standard and .NET Core to have a lightweight solution, eventually containerized in a container. Nowadays, if you are targeting SharePoint, you can use CISM for .NET Standard, and soon we will also have the PnP Core SDK, which is a graph-first SDK, which targets .NET Standard and .NET Core. So, what if you need to manage multiple environments? Well, let's assume that you need to manage, for example, a dev, a test, a staging, and a production environment. You can leverage the deployment slot on the Azure App Services. This will allow you to have multiple environments within a unique app service. You can have settings local to a specific slot or settings shared across all of the slots, and you can easily manage the life cycle of your slots in an independent way. At the same time, you can easily swap across different environments. So, for example, you can switch and swap from test to production, or you can do testing with something like the first release we have in Microsoft 365. So you can say that you want to provide the staging release of the solution to the 30% of the users, and you want to provide the reminder users, the 70% of reminder user with the production ready version of the solution, so that you can do testing of your new solution step by step. Above all, you need to keep into account that when you work with deployment slots in a unique Azure App Service, you have a unique bill to pay, the pay for that specific Azure App Service plan. And you don't pay for every single slot, but you pay just for the App Service plan, which is really good from a budgeting point of view. If you need to support multiple tenants, again, you need to think about how to do that. First of all, I usually work with a dev tenant whenever I'm developing my solutions. And you can easily have a free developer tenant if you go to the URL you see on this slide and you register there. You will get back a tenant which you can use as much as you can, and as long as you will keep on using it, it will be alive. If you will stop using it, it will expire and it will get deleted. Once you have done that, you have to consider what to do for the test, staging, and production. Well, if you can, you should try to use just a unique tenant for test, staging, and production, so that you can reuse the same set of users, the same Azure Active Directory, the same taxonomy, the same app registration in Azure Active Directory, and you can simply play, for example, in the fields of SharePoint Online with app catalogs local to a specific site collection for local testing and local versioning or upgrade tests in a local site collection. When you are ready, you release the solution in the global app catalog of the tenant. On the contrary, if you need to do something which is tenant-specific, like reading and writing taxonomy, provisioning users or resources, or generally speaking, touching the settings at tenant level, well, you will need to fall back to having multiple tenants. If you will do that, of course, it will be a bigger challenge for you, but as I said, if you really need to do that, why not? Nothing against that. If you need to store content, like for example, documentation, files, sample content, well, one option is to use, of course, OneDrive for Business. And you can also consider using OneDrive for Business to store personal settings of the users. In fact, you can easily get to the Microsoft Graph API a special folder for every single application registered in Azure Active Directory. And in there, on a user basis, you can store user-specific personal settings, for example, as a JSON file. Moreover, if you need to store documents with metadata, you should consider using SharePoint Online with a proper information architecture, so fields, content types, and libraries. Avoid using the content type hub, that's my advice, because that's an old technology not properly working nowadays. You should rather use the PnP provisioning engine or any other provisioning technique of your choice, so that you can keep the content types in sync across multiple site collections without relying on the content type hub. But generally speaking, if you need to support long-term documents, you should define a proper information architecture in SharePoint Online. On the contrary, if you simply need to store content like documentation or stuff where you need to have multiple authors with a flow to manage the authoring, you should consider using GitHub as the repository for this kind of content, and you can leverage the Git model to manage issues, commit, pull requests, and stuff like that. And you can easily read the content from GitHub using the REST APIs of the GitHub platform. From a monitoring and telemetry point of view, well, you can use Application Insights. Again, that's my advice. We use it heavily in our solutions. Application Insight is a brilliant and wonderful service that you can use for monitoring and storing telemetry of your code. You can get information about performances, about issues and exceptions. You can see the request flow. You can even log custom events and tags. That's what we do almost on a daily basis in our custom solutions. So that you can read the content of the application Insight, you can search for it, mind the retention, which is, if I'm not mistaken, by default is 90 days, but you can change it. And if you want, you can use it as the repository for all the telemetry and the monitoring information. Plus, if you want to store information about users' behavior, you can consider using an Azure SQL database for symmetric data or a Cosmos DB for asymmetric NoSQL data, so that you can then easily build a Power BI dashboard on top of this users' behavioral data and eventually on top of Application Insight telemetry data. This is really powerful, and you can keep an eye and you can control and measure the performances and the availability of your solution using this kind of approach. From a maintainability point of view, whenever you define a solution, you should think about the maintenance of the solution when you define the architecture. So You shouldn't define the maintenance plan as a side effect at the end of the solution, but you should include in the architecture design the definition of the maintenance plan of your solution. And you should choose the technologies that you want to leverage in your solution based on the maintenance plan and on the goals that you have from a maintenance point of view. So, for example, and again, in my opinion, you should rely on Azure App Services with deployment slots to have warm updates of the solution. You should use the Azure Service Bus for asynchronous communication and not the blob storage queue or other asynchronous communication systems, because with the Service Bus, you can easily, as I said, suspend a queue, suspend listening for a queue. You can update the job and you can resume listening for that queue once the job has been updated or the function. You can use SQL database and entity framework with data migrations so that you can easily keep in sync the schema of the application database with the domain entity model of your solution, so that you can, again, easily provision a new release of the solution with the smallest downtime for your users. And whenever you do that, keep into account that you should rely on a technology that will allow you to have a guarantee of having good versioning of code base, and binaries, so that you can eventually roll back a failing change, or you can track the history and the versions of your solution. So, that said, let me show you the real architecture of a solution that most likely you already used in production, the Microsoft SharePoint Lookbook site. The SharePoint Lookbook site is a site provided by Microsoft to provision site collections and site templates in SharePoint Online, leveraging the modern UI of SPO. And this is a solution fully based on Microsoft 365. This falls into the category of provisioning solutions, and it has a really nice and interesting architecture, specifically for the sake of discussing the architectural choices that we made. So, first of all, we have the front end, the lookbook.microsoft.com site, which nowadays is available to tenant admin users, but also to common site collection owners, so common end users. When a users make a request to the Lookbook site to provision a new site template, first of all, we will have Azure Active Directory in place, where we registered a couple of applications, one for tenant admin permissions level requests, and one for site collection owners permission level requests. We use the open authorization flow to get an access token and a refresh token from Azure Active Directory. And we store the refresh token in a secure environment, which is a SQL Azure database with an encrypted table, with an expire policy for the data. Then we enqueue into a queue in Service Bus the request to provision a site, so that we leverage the asynchronous pattern I was talking about before. And in the back end, we have a web job which will dequeue the message from the Service Bus and will process the actual request. In order to process the actual request, we need to have a token which will allow us to access the target environment on behalf of the requesting user. That's why we store the refresh token in the SQL Azure database as an encrypted object. And that's why we read that refresh token from the SQL database into the job, and we use the refresh token to make a request for an access token in Azure Active Directory. By doing that, we will be able to use the Microsoft Graph and the SharePoint REST API, working on behalf of the user consuming and requesting the provisioning through the Lookbook site, and we will be able to create the target site collection on behalf of the user and to do all of the stuff on behalf of the user. Then we get rid of the refresh token, we recycle it with an expire policy to not get any sensitive information longer than needed, and we store all of the telemetry information both for the web application and for the web job in the application insight service. As a side note, we use GitHub as the repository for the content, both for the UI and for the web job, so all of the templates are stored and maintained in the GitHub repository that we have. So this is a clear example of a middle complex solution. It's not the most complex ever, but it is not so simple, that you can take inspiration from whenever you want to create your custom solutions built on top of Microsoft 365. That said, I hope you enjoyed this session and I hope you like it. Let me know. Please fill the feedback form and let me know what's your feeling about this content and about this session. And again, thank you for attending this session and for joining me today.